Third video. Okay, thank you. Sandy again. I wanted to cover off in this video on some of the songs that you may not know that are songs by Aboriginal performers who were absolutely challenging the ideas within their genre and often within their community. So I wanted to start with Harold Blair. So Harold Blair has passed away. There is permission to use his name, but he was a remarkable performer, singer, and as you can hear, tenor. This was recorded in the 50s. He came from working in the fields. He's a Waka Waka boy, and was very well known in both Sydney and Melbourne, and travelled internationally as a performer. And obviously he's working in opera and light opera, and this was not a genre that people thought of Aboriginal people performing in. And so in a whole lot of ways his life was treated like a curio. But he was an incredible advocate. You know, he was somebody who spent a lot of years working in the education space. In fact, his daughter, Nerida Blair, is a professor and has worked extensively across higher education over the last 40 years. And, you know, we have this kind of legacy that goes beyond the music. And we see that too in Deborah Cheetham. This is an excerpt from Pecan Summer. Deborah is part of Stolen Generations, and this piece, Pecan Summer, and you'll see that there's a link to an excerpt from it, is considered to be the first Aboriginal opera. It only came out 4 years ago actually, and it has been performed a number of times, but actually only once at the Opera House. Thankfully we have an amazing company, Short Black Opera, that has, you know, furthered this work, but it raises a lot of questions, and as it should. You know, is this music that Aboriginal people are interested in? Yeah, why not? Is this music that's representative of Aboriginal people? Absolutely. It's a Stolen Generation story, of course. You know, is this an important musical contribution? Sure. I mean, they're my answers, you know, but there's a much more complex set of questions around it as well that are really worth considering. And again, it goes back to the idea of what people are really interested in and what they see representing. This isn't about representing all Aboriginal people. Nobody either should or, you know, does do that. This is about contributing and finding a place, but also taking a space. And, you know, in a lot of ways, the first person that many of us saw who did that was was Royal Telephone. It was for a lot of Australians, it was the first time that they'd seen an Aboriginal person performing. This was on bandstand, so it was on national TV in the 60s, early 60s. And that's a remarkable part of this journey and this story. Is it country music? Is it music about God? Is it music that's probably read as a little reductive? Yeah. But it also spoke to rural and regional people. And in those days, a lot of Aboriginal people lived regionally and rurally. Now, obviously, a lot more of us live in metropolitan areas. There are always a lot of us in metropolitan areas as well, but there's obviously a lot more people who've moved to the cities, and so it was a very interesting and important pivot point for Aboriginal people at a time where we didn't have a whole lot of rights, where we didn't have a whole lot of opportunities. This was, being provided in that way. So I think then that journey back to thinking about country music is a really interesting one. And it takes us again to thinking about the way that we've engaged with music generally. Probably our best known country performer at the moment, best known Aboriginal country performer at the moment would be Troy Cassar-Daley, who writes, largely for a mainstream audience, though certainly writes very political work.
East to west, north to south, to get it from the horse's mouth, those true stories on the ground. On a blazing summer's day, Charlie Perkins led the way at the public pool in Moree.
That's Freedom Ride, and again, I've got a link up. I think if you can engage with some of this material and hear the truth of it, and rather than the kind of broader idea of Troy Cassar-Daley as a country music performer, recognising that actually what he's contributing is this incredibly important part of the narrative of Aboriginal people in this country. And that's what music's been able to do. It's kind of the populist nature of a whole lot of this music that I've played has meant that it's recalibrated people's idea of who Aboriginal people are. It's been persuasive, and it's been absolutely challenging as well. When we were listening before to AB Original, that's a really good example. That is challenging idea. This is a centrally challenging idea, and as it should be. It's saying January 26 is incredibly problematic for Aboriginal people, and we're not going to apologise for saying change the date. So, it's doing that kind of political work that music does. And it's doing it through persuasive language. The whole process of language is really interesting, because when we go back to treaty, my guess is that when you listen to treaty again, you're not going to know what anything means, when you're listening to it in Yolngu, when you're listening to the Yolngu words. You're not, you're listening to it as utterances. You're not listening to it as text with meaning in that way, even though there's obviously, English language within treaty as well. And that's really interesting. Does it have the same power? Does it have the same, does it work the same way? Does it suddenly become emblematic rather than, descriptive? And is that problematic? And yeah, it's super interesting. But, as you start to unpack this, part of it is seeing the sequence of what was happening in culture at the time. So you look at, Uncle Jimmy Little doing Royal Telephone in the 60s before the referendum. You look at the work that's happening particularly across the 70s, where you have a number of Aboriginal performers working in the theatre area. You have a number of bands kind of touring but never getting a whole lot of airtime. And you have some really crucial, performers who are making inroads, but really not being elevated, not finding a radio space. And that's where you look at the next thing that we're going to talk about in the next video, which is a little bit about some of the reactive space, protest space too, but I'd say it was a reaction to how we engage and how we engaged. So that's coming up as we talk about Radio Skid Row. Thanks.